The silence didn't break quietly, it cracked like thunder. Because when word spread that Ron Howard had finally pulled back the curtain on 6 untouchable Hollywood legends, the industry didn't brace itself, it panicked. These weren't fringe names. These were icons. The kind whose reputations feel carved into marble. And according to whispers now ripping through back channels and private group chats, what's being discussed behind closed doors is far darker than the public ever imagined. For decades, Hollywood sold us myths. Heroes, visionaries, smiling faces attached to timeless projects. But insiders say that behind the awards, the standing ovations, and the carefully managed legacies, there were compromises made, power games played, and decisions buried so deep they were never meant to surface. Until now, according to the chatter, Ron didn't name names publicly. He didn't have to. The clues were enough. The timelines lined up. The reactions were immediate. Agents went quiet. Old interviews were suddenly scrubbed. And people who never respond to rumors started issuing no-comment statements like their careers depended on it. Fans are spiraling. Clips are being rewatched. Acceptance speeches are being reinterpreted. That charming laugh. Now it sounds different. That inspirational quote. Now it hits wrong. Because once the illusion cracks, you start seeing the shadows that were always there. And the most unsettling part. Insiders claim this isn't about scandal, it's about patterns. About how fame protects behavior. About how silence gets rewarded. And about how some legends weren't just complicit, they were architects. Stay right here. Because once you hear how these 6 figures allegedly fit into a system built on secrecy and power, you'll realize Hollywood's golden age may have been darker than anyone was ready to admit. The first tremor didn't come from a quote. It came from a reaction. According to whispers echoing through industry circles, the moment Ron Howard allegedly spoke candidly in a closed setting, the temperature in the room changed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones went face down. Smiles froze, because whatever he said didn't sound like bitterness or revisionist history. It sounded like someone who had watched too much, too closely, for too long. Insiders say this wasn't a takedown. It was a reckoning. Not delivered with names and accusations, but with patterns so specific they landed like fingerprints. Decades of Hollywood behavior suddenly reframed as something coordinated rather than coincidental. Success stories recast as carefully curated narratives. And the idea that everyone knew, but no one said anything finally dragged into the light. What shook people most wasn't the darkness itself, it was the familiarity. According to the chatter, Ron didn't describe monsters lurking in the shadows. He described systems, rooms where power pooled, dynamics where silence was currency, traditions passed down not as rules but as understandings. If you wanted longevity, you learned quickly what not to question. Fans began digging almost immediately. Old interviews resurfaced where questions were dodged. Award speeches that now sounded like coded gratitude. Collaborations that seemed inexplicably protected from criticism. The internet, once primed, began connecting dots with unsettling ease. It wasn't about one bad actor. It was about a culture that rewarded compliance and punished curiosity. According to those close to the situation, Ron's words weren't angry. They were measured. That's what made them more dangerous. He spoke like someone who had made peace with the cost of speaking late and decided the cost of staying quiet had finally grown heavier. There was no call to cancel, no demand for heads to roll, just a clear-eyed acknowledgement that legends are often built by committees, and committees don't stay clean. The 6 figures allegedly referenced weren't described as villains. They were described as beneficiaries. Of timing, of protection, of a system that shielded certain behaviors while celebrating output. And that distinction matters because it reframes accountability. It's easier to condemn a villain than to interrogate a structure that keeps producing them. Hollywood insiders say the fallout was immediate and subtle. Meetings postponed. Appearances quietly declined. Old allies suddenly unavailable. People who had coasted on nostalgia felt the ground shift beneath them, not because anyone accused them of anything, but because the conversation changed. Once the myth cracks, it never seals the same way again. Fans noticed something else too, who stayed silent. Not everyone rushed to deny, not everyone laughed it off. Some of the most powerful names did nothing, and that nothing spoke volumes. In an industry that thrives on statements, silence can be the loudest response. The narrative gaining traction suggests that Ron's perspective carries weight because of where he sits in Hollywood's ecosystem. Not an outsider throwing stones. Not a rebel seeking attention, but a steady presence who benefited from the system while observing its costs. That vantage point gives his words a different gravity. He wasn't excluded. He was included, and that inclusion showed him the machinery. Online discussions quickly shifted from gossip to introspection. Fans asked uncomfortable questions about their own consumption, about how often they separate art from artist without examining the industry that enables both, about how nostalgia can anesthetize scrutiny, and about whether legends deserve immunity simply because they shaped childhoods. According to speculative accounts, Ron's comments hinted at trade-offs that were never explicit but always understood, opportunities that came with expectations, silence that was rewarded with access, criticism that quietly closed doors. None of it illegal, none of it dramatic, all of it effective. That's what made it darker than imagined, the banality of it. Industry veterans chimed in anonymously, reinforcing the idea that nothing Ron implied was shocking to those who'd been around long enough. What shocked them was that someone of his stature was willing to say it out loud, even indirectly. Especially now, when reputations are fragile and legacies feel negotiable. The 6 legends remain unnamed in public discourse, but speculation thrives in the vacuum. Fans match timelines, collaborations, and reactions. But the story resists tidy conclusions because it isn't about catching anyone. It's about understanding how a machine runs and who it protects by default. As this first chapter settles, the mood is less explosive and more uneasy. Because if the whispers are true, then Hollywood's darkest truths aren't hidden in scandals waiting to be exposed. They're embedded in routines we normalized long ago. And once that realization takes hold, it becomes impossible to unsee. This isn't a fall from grace story. It's a slow tilt of the frame. A reminder that legends are human, systems are powerful, and silence is rarely neutral. And if Ron Howard truly opened this door, even a crack, the industry now has to decide whether it will step through or quietly close it and pretend nothing happened. Either way, the air has changed. And when the air changes in Hollywood, everyone feels it, even those who insist they don't. As the second wave of discussion rolled in, the story stopped being about what Ron Howard allegedly said and started becoming about why it landed so hard. According to insiders, the discomfort wasn't rooted in shock, it was rooted in recognition. People weren't hearing something new. They were hearing something familiar said plainly, without the usual varnish of nostalgia and deflection. The industry reaction, according to whispers, split instantly into 2 camps. One group moved to minimize, framing the comments as contextless reflections or industry folklore. The other went silent, not because they didn't disagree, but because they recognized the terrain Ron was describing. That silence wasn't empty. It was cautious, calculated, the kind of quiet that comes from knowing a conversation has begun that can't be controlled once it gains traction. Fans began noticing patterns in the aftermath. Schedules shifted. Appearances were quietly canceled. Certain collaborations were paused without explanation. These weren't punishments. They were recalibrations. When the narrative changes, risk assessments change with it. And according to speculation, Ron's comments altered how risk was being measured, not legally, but reputationally. What made this phase darker wasn't accusation. It was implication. Insiders claim Ron didn't describe crimes. He described climates, environments where influence flowed unevenly, where access was conditional, where speaking up didn't cost you everything immediately, it just made everything harder over time. Fewer calls returned, fewer invitations extended, fewer chances offered without explanation. That's the kind of system that leaves no fingerprints. Online, the conversation matured. Fans stopped asking, "Who did what?" and started asking, "How did this keep happening?" Threads exploded with timelines of careers that seemed inexplicably protected. Figures who survived controversies that derailed others. Comebacks that felt effortless. Scandals that evaporated. Patterns that once felt coincidental now looked structural. According to the chatter, Ron's words resonated because he didn't exempt himself. He didn't posture as morally superior. He positioned himself as complicit by proximity, someone who benefited from stability while observing the cost paid by those without it. That acknowledgement matters. It reframes the story from whistleblowing to witness. Hollywood veterans, speaking anonymously, reinforced this framing. They described an industry where reputations are assets managed collectively, where certain people become too expensive to tarnish, where the calculus isn't right or wrong, but risk and return. If protecting someone keeps money flowing, protection becomes policy. Fans found this idea unsettling because it challenges the myth of meritocracy. the belief that talent alone sustains longevity. According to this narrative, longevity often depends on alignment with the right people, the right rooms, the right silences. And once aligned, the system bends to preserve its investments. The 6 unnamed legends became symbols rather than suspects. The point wasn't to identify them, it was to recognize how many could fit the description. That ambiguity is what unsettled people most. When a story implicates a system, anyone who thrived within it feels exposed, even if they did nothing wrong. Insiders say this is why some responses felt defensive rather than dismissive. Defensive language signals perceived threat, not guilt, vulnerability. The sense that the rules everyone assumed were unspoken had just been spoken aloud, and once spoken, they can be questioned. The phrase circulating in private conversations, according to the rumor mill, was the quiet rules. Rules no one signs. Rules no one teaches directly. Rules you learn by watching who succeeds and who disappears. Ron's alleged comments didn't list the rules. They simply acknowledged their existence. And that acknowledgement alone disrupted the balance. Fans also began interrogating their own role. Nostalgia became suspect. Comfort became questionable. The realization dawned that loving the work doesn't absolve the system that produced it. That separating art from artist is incomplete if you don't also examine the industry that decides whose art survives scrutiny. This phase wasn't explosive. It was corrosive. Doubt seeped in slowly, dissolving assumptions rather than shattering them. And corrosive narratives are harder to contain because they don't rely on proof, they rely on plausibility. According to speculation, Ron's position insulated him from immediate backlash. His reputation as steady, uncontroversial, and thoughtful gave his words credibility. He wasn't seen as seeking attention or revenge. He was seen as reflecting. And reflection, coming from someone who thrived, carries weight. Hollywood's response, insiders say, was to wait it out. Let the cycle move on. Let the audience tire. But the problem with systemic stories is that they don't burn out quickly. They resurface. They attach to new examples. They become lenses rather than events. Fans began spotting those lenses everywhere. In interviews where questions were redirected. In award shows where tributes felt overly curated. In documentaries that felt incomplete. The absence of critique became a form of critique itself. By the end of this phase, the mood had shifted from curiosity to unease. Not outrage, unease, because outrage targets individuals. Unease targets environments. And environments are harder to dismantle than people. As this section closes, one thing is clear in the speculative narrative. Ron Howard didn't expose secrets as much as he named a feeling many had carried without language. The feeling that Hollywood's shine is maintained not by innocence, but by management. That legends aren't just celebrated, they're protected. And that protection, once normalized, becomes invisible. The door Ron allegedly cracked open didn't reveal monsters. It revealed maintenance. And maintenance, when you finally see it, raises a question no industry likes to answer. Who benefits when silence becomes tradition? That question is still hanging. And it's heavier now than it was before. By the time the third phase of this story settled in, something irreversible had happened. The conversation stopped chasing exposure and started demanding accountability without names. And that shift is what truly unsettled Hollywood. Because you can defend individuals, you can deny allegations, but you can't easily defend a system once people recognize how it functions. According to whispers, this is where Ron Howard's alleged remarks did their most lasting damage, not because they accused anyone, but because they reframed success itself. The idea took hold that longevity in Hollywood isn't merely earned. It's curated, maintained, protected by networks that value stability over scrutiny. And once that idea spreads, every legacy becomes a question mark. Industry veterans, speaking anonymously, say the mood turned inward. Meetings weren't canceled, they became quieter. Decisions weren't reversed, they were delayed. Executives asked different questions. Not is this true, but what happens if this becomes the lens? Because lenses change behavior. They alter risk tolerance. They invite reevaluation of stories long considered settled. Fans noticed a subtle pivot in messaging. Tributes leaned heavier on craft than character. Interviews avoided moral framing. Press tour emphasized process over personality. It wasn't coordinated, but it was consistent. According to speculation, when systems feel seen, they instinctively minimize surfaces that invite inspection. What made this phase especially destabilizing was how little it relied on proof. It relied on plausibility. on lived experience echoed across decades by people who had nothing to gain from lying and everything to lose from speaking. Ron's alleged comments, measured and indirect, were the spark, but the fuel had been accumulating for years. The 6 unnamed legends became less important than the roles they symbolized. Not villains, but pillars. Figures whose careers were so foundational that questioning the conditions around them felt like questioning Hollywood itself. And that's where the real anxiety set in. Because if the pillars aren't spotless, the structure isn't either. Online, the discourse matured again. People stopped asking for exposés and started asking for reforms. Not cancellations, but guardrails. Transparency in decision-making. Accountability for gatekeeping. Protections for those without leverage. The tone wasn't punitive, it was corrective. And corrective narratives scare institutions more than scandals because they don't fade with the news cycle. According to insiders, the most uncomfortable realization was this: the system doesn't need bad people to function problematically. It needs incentives. It needs silence to be rewarded and disruption to be costly. Over time, those incentives shape behavior without anyone issuing orders. That's how cultures persist without conspiracies. This reframing landed hardest with audiences who grew up idolizing Hollywood's golden figures. Nostalgia became complicated. Admiration now came with footnotes. Fans didn't stop loving the work, but they stopped assuming the work existed in a vacuum. The separation between art, artist, and industry widened, and in that gap, questions multiplied. Hollywood's traditional defenses, denial, distraction, deflection, felt less effective here. There was no allegation to refute, no claim to litigate, just a perspective that rang true to too many people to dismiss. According to speculation, that's why the response remained muted. You can't argue someone out of recognition. Ron Howard's alleged role in this story became almost symbolic. Not a crusader, not a whistleblower. A witness who finally described the weather. And once someone names the weather, everyone else has to admit they've been standing in it. Behind the scenes, insiders say conversations began shifting toward legacy management. Not PR spin, but structural legacy. How histories are archived. Who tells them? What gets funded going forward? Because if the past can be reinterpreted, the future has to be shaped more carefully. The unease wasn't universal. Some dismissed the moment as overblown. Others insisted the industry had already changed. But even among skeptics, there was acknowledgement that something had shifted. The confidence that legends were untouchable had weakened. Not because of wrongdoing, but because untouchability itself now felt suspect. This phase also revealed a generational divide. Younger creatives resonated deeply with the critique of quiet rules. They recognized the dynamics instantly because they were navigating them now. Older figures, according to whispers, felt exposed, not personally, but philosophically. The rules they mastered were being questioned by people who never agreed to them. Fans began asking a harder question. If silence was the price of access, how many stories never got told? How many voices redirected? How many careers stalled not for lack of talent, but for lack of alignment? These questions didn't accuse, they illuminated. And illumination is difficult to reverse. As the narrative settled, the absence of a next shoe became the point. No big reveal, no list, no courtroom drama. Just a sustained awareness that changed how people interpreted power. That kind of change doesn't trend for a week, it reshapes expectations over years. According to the speculative narrative, Hollywood didn't crumble, it adjusted. And adjustment, when driven by scrutiny, is a form of admission. Not of guilt, but of vulnerability. The acknowledgement that the myths were too simple for the reality they covered. This is where the story rests, not in exposure, but in consequence. The consequence of naming systems instead of scapegoats, of questioning incentives instead of individuals, of realizing that legends can be both brilliant and protected, both talented and insulated. If Ron Howard truly cracked this door, it didn't lead to a dark room full of secrets. It led to a hallway everyone had been walking down for years without noticing the walls. Now the walls are visible. And once visible, they can't be unseen. Hollywood will continue. The work will continue. The legends will remain. But the spell has changed. The shine now carries a shadow, not of scandal, but of awareness. And awareness is the one thing no industry can fully control once it spreads. If you're still here, it's because this story didn't feel like gossip. It felt like a veil being lifted. This wasn't about tearing anyone down. It was about recognizing how power actually works when the cameras are off and the legends are protected by silence instead of truth. So don't scroll away now. Hit that like button immediately. because engagement is the only way conversations like this don't disappear under nostalgia and denial. Liking this video tells the algorithm that people want more than myths, they want understanding. They want context. They want honesty about how influence is built and maintained. Drop a comment and say what unsettled you the most. Was it the idea of quiet rules, the power of silence, or realizing how many careers might have been shaped by forces no one talks about out loud? The comments are where this conversation becomes collective, not just commentary. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe right now and turn notifications on. Because stories like this don't end with one video. More people speak, more patterns surface, more dots connect. And when that happens, you don't want to be catching up after the narrative has already evolved without you. This isn't about canceling legends. It's about questioning systems. It's about refusing to confuse success with innocence. Stay locked in because once awareness spreads, nothing ever looks the same again.